Terrance, thank you so much for joining us, former Colorado Speaker of the House, as well as former police officer. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So after an event that we know of as East High School, after an event like this, tell me a little bit, considering your experience, what you see as happening now in terms of legislative action.
Anytime we see an event like East, any high school shooting, any event that is a major crisis that traumatizes people, there's a tendency for lawmakers, policymakers to try to fix it right away. And oftentimes you end up with reactionary lawmaking, reactionary policies that may at the time seem like good politics, but long term it's probably bad public policy.
So you were elected in 2002 and then sworn in 2003, and just a few years after Columbine. So tell me a little bit about the cycle that you've seen over the past 20 years when an event as tragic as this continues to happen.
I mean, after Columbine, I remember it vividly because I was married then. I was dropping my stepdaughter off at school when I heard the news about what was happening. And immediately everyone was like, okay, we need to change the law. We need to do this. We need to do that, which is understandable. And it's what you expect because people are fearful. I was fearful. Parents who had children at Columbine, other high schools were fearful. So you see lawmakers then respond to the perceived needs, that fear that people have. Sometimes you get good law out of it, sometimes you get bad law out of it, but it's a constant cycle that happens over and over again. And it happens because lawmakers, in the way that we do law, is reactionary. We respond to things that happen as opposed to being proactive most of the time.
What harm can that do when the reaction is maybe too fast and maybe not thought through?
I mean, the harm that that happens is that you end up stuck with a law that may not have been very well thought through. All the consequences, the unintended consequences. And granted, you can never know what they all are, even when you take time to go through it. But you're more likely to have consequences that you didn't even think about because you didn't take time to step back and say, whoa, if we do this, this thing over here may happen. And I think someone once said, if I was a better student, I remember who said it, for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. And the same goes for lawmaking. It's not just a law of physics, Sir Isaac Newton. It's just not a law of physics, it's a law of public policy. For every action there's an equal and opposite reaction.
Something that we know has been a reaction to this is now armed officers being in some DPS schools. I know that you talked a little bit about this on Twitter, but what is your concern about that being a reaction just a few days after this happened?
Yeah, my number one reaction is that I think we have to avoid, well, I'm not a we anymore, but I think lawmakers have to avoid giving our communities a false sense of hope. That somehow that if we do this thing here, in this case, put law enforcement officers, armed law enforcement officers, back in the classroom, back in the school buildings, that automatically it's going to make a school safe. That's not necessarily true. The research that we've seen on this and that 9 News has done in previous stories shows that that's not necessarily true. And so are we just providing a panacea? There's nothing necessarily wrong about that, but just be honest about it. That's what we're doing. We want to make you feel safe right now, right here, so we're going to do this.
What would you consider a better alternative?
I think the better alternative, I mean, I'm not sure if there is a better alternative, because we're not sure. Well, even Chief Thomas said that even if there had been an SRO on campus, they would not have been involved in the pat down of that student and likely not even in the area. So I'm not sure what the other alternative is. Maybe if you know that a student's on some type of safety plan, that you actually have an officer nearby, whether it's a DPS campus safety officer or a DPD or Denver Police Department school resource officer somewhere nearby. Maybe it is that we invest more money in alternative high schools. There's a whole slew of things. We don't know which one of those things would have prevented this, but we do know that there's a whole litany of things that we could have done and that we still can do down the pike. I just worry that we're going to tell parents that we're going to put armed officers in the schools and your kids will be safe. And I just don't think that's fair to students. I don't think that's fair to parents.
Maybe giving a false idea of what safety is or if they are safe.
Correct.
Now, as the first Black Speaker of the House, I know there's been some discussion about SROs and the impact that it could potentially have on minority communities or the diverse population and student population that DPS has. Do you have any concern about that?
I do, and I think the school board, when they voted to take SROs out the building, although I'm going to comment on whether that was a right decision or a wrong decision, but the logic behind it was really very much based on what we know to be true, which is that Black and brown students in Denver public schools are inordinately have interactions with police officers that end up with bad outcomes. We know that to be true. And so it made sense to say, at least this part made sense. So let's look at how we deploy school resource officers in our public schools and our high schools. Let's look at that at least. Does this make sense? And are we putting our Black and brown students, especially our young men, at higher risk of going into the school to prison pipeline? And I think that was a good discussion for the school board to have. But I also think, on the other hand, the school board needed to have a further discussion with parents and with students and with the community about the fears around not having officers in school. Because we know we live in an environment where school shootings are way too frequent, they happen way too often. And folks are afraid about that. And that's legitimate. Fear's not a bad thing. Just fear that when you act irrationally on fear, that's when it becomes a bad thing. But people were fearful, and there probably was a better way to approach this. So I still remain concerned about having SROs in schools and having more guns in schools. I'm very concerned about that. But we have to take seriously that people really want to feel safe. And if I had kids, I want my kid. I don't have kids, but I want my friends' kids. I have a lot of friends who have kids at East. I want their kids to feel safe because they're like my kids too. And so I don't want to give them a false perception that they're safe just because there's some man or some woman in the school with a badge on with a gun.
When you were the person making laws and in the legislature, how did you balance making policy under pressure?
One of the things that I always tried to do was take a step back from the immediate crisis. And when you're someone who's involved in crisis management, crisis managers will always tell you, you have to take a step back from that immediate crisis and try to take a broader view. Try to look from a 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 square foot perspective and look down so you can see the whole landscape as opposed to getting caught up in the one big pine tree that's right in front of you. I tried my best to do that. Wasn't always successful at it, but at least I had it in my brain, I thought, that I needed to take a step back from this immediate crisis. And the same in law enforcement. One of the things they teach you when you're dealing with a crisis in law enforcement, you have to be the adult in the room. And by being the adult in the room, that means that you take a step back from all the emotion of the thing, of the situation that you're in, and you step back and you think about what's going on. Just take a moment. It doesn't have to be 5 minutes. Or the proverbial 5 minutes. It could be 30 seconds, but sometimes that's what you need is to take 30 seconds to step back and you get a different perspective.
What would you like to see come out of, obviously, something horrible that happened, but what would you like to see as an outcome from this tragedy?
I would like for this state and also nationally for us to have a more comprehensive view of what school safety looks like and not get ourselves in the middle of a binary conversation, because once you get there, you preclude a whole range of options. So it's not should cops be in the building or should cops not be in the building. And I would hope that we move away from defund the police versus pro-police and look at what things actually work in terms of providing safety in our schools. And I think that's the important part. Be evidence-based, be thoughtful, but also take into account the lived experiences of people, those things that motivate people on that very primordial level, that very base level, those things that, gnaw at people. You have to take those into account. It's not just facts and figures, it's emotions and feelings. And so I hope that we have that conversation and that we be honest with each other in that conversation.
Is there anything else that you'd like to add or say?
No, I'm good, I think.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate
thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you.